Hey guys, I'm Papa Pete, and welcome to today's episode of The 125. The 125 is my YouTube show where I go over the 125 original games released for the Intellivision System between 1979 and 1989. And today's game, it's one that we had back when I was a kid. Today's game is Auto Racing. Here we go. It gives me great pleasure to announce the reopening of IntellivisionCollector.com, the official sponsor of the 125. For all your Intellivision collecting needs, that's IntellivisionCollector.com. I think that people have been racing cars since about 15 minutes after Henry Ford invented the second one. And with that in mind, racing games have been very popular in video game world ever since very early in the 70s. With so many successful arcade racing games such as Grand Track, Night Driver, or Superbug, home console manufacturers knew they had to bring racing games into the living rooms. Atari had already released Street Racer, as well as Indy 500 and their own version of Night Driver, well before Mattel had even released the Intellivision System. With that in mind, Mattel made Auto Racing their 9th release overall, being released on October 3rd, 1980, alongside the hits Horse Racing, Las Vegas Roulette, NHL Hockey, and Sea Battle. Larry Zwick was the programmer for Auto Racing. His only other significant work for Mattel Electronics was M Network's Air Raiders. With Auto Racing, Mattel was trying to continue the trend of releasing the most realistic sports games possible, which they'd already started with NFL football, NBA basketball, and Major League Baseball. Auto Racing is a 1 or 2 player game where players can choose from one of 5 different cars to race on one of 5 different tracks. The 5 different cars are the white car, which tops out at 55 miles per hour and has poor acceleration, but it's the best cornering car, making it the easiest to control. This is the car that novice players should start with. The green car, which can go 65 miles an hour and has excellent acceleration. It also has pretty good cornering. The red car, which is similar to the green car, but it can go a bit faster at 75 miles an hour, but doesn't accelerate quite as well. But it still has good acceleration. Just like the green car, it has very good cornering. The last 2 cars are the tan and the blue car, which other than the color, are identical in every other way. They're by far the fastest cars in the game at 90 miles an hour, but they accelerate very poorly, and they only have fair cornering. They're definitely the most difficult cars to control, but frankly they're the only 2 that you can choose in a 2-player game so that the 2 players have the exact same quality of a car. You have to choose different color cars when you play a 2-player game, so these are the 2 to pick if you want to have equal standings as you play. On that note, let's talk about the difference between 1-player and 2-player games in auto racing. In a 2-player game, you're not playing to get the total distance that you could travel or a certain number of laps. You're simply trying to get to 50 points sooner than your opponent. There are 2 different ways you can score points in 2-player auto racing. The first one is to get ahead, and that's by getting far enough ahead on the screen that you basically get an entire screen width out front. It's about 12 car lengths. And if you manage to do that, the screen stops, it says ahead in the color of the car that's won that point, and you get 1 point. The second way you can score points is you get 2 points if your opponent crashes into an obstacle, whether it's a house or a tree or whatever. When somebody does crash, what happens is the screen stops, it says crash in the bottom in the color of the car that actually crashed. The opponent's awarded 2 points, and then you start up again just behind the last checkpoint that you both crossed on that track. The actual object of the game is to be the first car to get to 50 points. In the 1-player game, it's completely a race against the clock. What you're trying to do is complete 5 circuits of that track as quickly as possible. If you do happen to crash, control's the name of the game here, if you do happen to crash, you stop and you start up again at the checkpoint, the last checkpoint that you crossed on the track. Another thing I want to mention really quickly is how you actually start and choose between a one-player and a two-player game. Simply put, you pick up the controller and you choose the color of your car and you hit enter. If you have two players, each player does so. But if you only want to play a one-player game, first thing you do is select your color car and hit enter on your controller, and then you have to hit enter on the other controller. It's a rather unique way to start, kind of interesting, but that is the trick to doing it if you're having any troubles. Now, as for the tracks, like I mentioned before, there are 5 different tracks, each one of increasing difficulty. Track number 1 is the most basic track. It's the easiest one to navigate. It's really where you should start. The corners are obtuse, they're not very sharp, and frankly, it's where you want to start to get some practice and learn how to control and steer your car around the track without crashing into things. Track number 2 is actually the largest track in the course with long straight stretches. On track number 2, the main challenges that you're going to face are the big speed that you have and the reactions for making the corners when they really come upon you quickly. Track number 3, right in the middle, it's the absolute perfect median between these 5 different tracks because it has a combination of both. It has some long straight stretches as you go down one side of the track or up one side of the track, and it also on the other side has a series of winding curves that are challenging to drive through but not impossible. Track 4 is long and it's windy and it's hard. You have to have a lot of skill to circumnavigate this track without crashing. Finally, we have track number 5. Short and sharp and brutal. Of all these courses, it's definitely just hairpin after hairpin. Very difficult to control your car when you're driving on this track. And frankly, if you play a 2-player game on this track, you may get to 50 points before you ever make it a complete lap around. Before I move on, there's something very interesting that I want to talk about with regards to the tracks in auto racing. It turns out that the 5 tracks were created on one overall globe-like surface. This means that it's possible to drive off one track, and if you can avoid the obstacles, you can drive onto another. There's even various small strips of track, like little drag strips, that aren't part of any of the 5 tracks. I used to try to get to the other tracks all the time when I was a kid. If you do manage to get to another track and you do some laps on it, you got to be really careful not to crash, because if you do crash, you go back to the last checkpoint crossed, but on your original track, not the one that you're on at the time. Finally, here's something that you can look for. There actually is a magical spot, it's almost like a sweet spot I'll call it, where you can get your car going east-west and it will go through the entire globe, off one side, back onto the other. You can go east-west or west-east, doesn't matter. And you can avoid all obstacles and your car will just keep going over and over and over again. I don't know, it's pretty hard to find. If you do manage to find that, make sure you record it, make sure you post it, because I'll tell you this, I want to see it. The controls in auto racing are actually very simple, but at the same time, it's one of the most complicated sagas surrounding this game's release and subsequent development. First of all, let's talk about braking. Braking is simple enough. You have 4 action buttons on the side of the controller, and if you hit any one of those, your car will brake. You want to brake your car, you get going too fast because it helps you maintain a little bit of control going around corners, or possibly if you get off track, you're heading towards an obstacle, you can hit the brakes and try to stop before you get there, regain control, and avoid it and get back on the track. And now let's talk about the steering. There are actually 2 different ROM variations of auto racing. The original release version, which had one method of steering, and then after some complaints from the public, they changed this method of steering and altered the ROM in subsequent releases. One type of steering was known as directional or intuitive steering, and with this method the car always turned towards the direction that you pushed in the disc, no matter what the car's orientation was on the screen. If you wanted the turn to go up, you'd push up on the disc. If you wanted to turn right, you'd push right on the disc, etc. Generally speaking, Intellivision players did not like this method of steering. In response to public complaints, Mattel had later versions of auto racing released with a modified ROM that gave it a realistic method of steering. Pushing right on the disc turned the nose of the car right, and pushing left on the disc turned the car left, no matter what the car's orientation was on the screen. At the end of the day, both versions of the steering have advocates. Some find the intuitive or directional version of steering easier, and some prefer the simulation style of directional steering. Other than looking at the manual to see what type of steering your card actually has, there's no way to tell by looking at the card itself. Another interesting tidbit regarding these steering differences is that even Mr. Intellivision, Keith Robinson himself, used to get these releases mixed up. It's how confusing it is. It is so confusing as to which came first. He used to say that it was the realistic method of steering that came first. Most people now agree that it was the intuitive version that was first, validated by the manuals and within the code of the earlier and later cartridges. That being said, earlier intuitive versions of the ROM also had an Easter egg in them where you could hold in 1, 6, and 9, hit reset, and then you could convert the cartridge over and play it as a realistic method of steering. It's so amazing how complicated this little saga of which ROM came first, or which came first, the chicken or the egg. There's so much discussion and confusion surrounding these versions that the exact chain of events surrounding the release of auto racing and the development of the ROM may always be in dispute. The graphics in auto racing are actually pretty decent. In fact, when you think about it being 1980, they're really kind of top-notch compared to other racing genre games of the day. I mean, there isn't extreme detail by any stretch of the imagination, but the grass is a nice colored green with a little bit of variation in it. The track itself is a nice light asphalt gray, and the other obstacles such as ponds, houses, and trees are all well represented, and they're well laid out, and they're really easy to distinguish. The racing cars themselves are all fairly detailed as well, and even though they're all one-color sprites, they actually have a black shadowing effect that gives them a little bit of a 3D effect. And it's very clear when you watch the game, when you play the game, that these are open-wheeled racers. So it's nice to have them with enough detail that you actually can see that fact. Overall, I'd call the graphics good. The sounds in auto racing aren't very diversive, frankly, and one thing they are is very constant. For example, when your car's rolling, the sound of the engine is a constant purr that varies in pitch a bit with the speed that you're actually traveling. It doesn't go away. It's there all the time. Also, as you're cornering or if you're ever spinning out, of course the tires squeal with a high-pitched shriek. And the pitch and the volume of these squealing tires also is directly related to the effect or the magnitude of the spin that you're having. And of course, with every auto racing game, you have to have crashing sounds. Now, in the two-player game, your cars do crash together. You can't occupy the same spot. The cars will run into each other, and it makes a crashing noise. You don't lose points or give the other player points when you crash into the car, but it is very easy to lose control when you're crashing into the other player. As for crashing into obstacles, such as trees or houses or whatever, it's a standard crashing noise. It's pretty much the same sound, whether it's a house or a tree or whatever, but the splash of going into a pond, which doesn't give you points, it's not considered a crash when you go to a pond. You just get slowed down to a crawl so the other player can get ahead quite easily. It's fairly well done, but overall, nothing too amazing. Finally, of course, this sound is in a lot of games. When you finish a race, either get the points or you finish the 5 laps, you get to hear that regular cheering noise that's done on the Intellivision exec. It's a fantastic sound, I know, but overall, I'm just going to call these sounds in auto racing middle of the road. They're not bad, but they're not great either, and frankly, as you're playing the game, they tend to wear on the nerves a little bit, so they're just a little bit monotonous. Auto racing is another game that I had back when I was a kid, but unfortunately, I played it a ton, but I never really developed that nostalgic love of the game. Maybe it's because it was so difficult that I didn't get to play it 2 players a whole lot because it was difficult to pick up and play for other people, so it was hard to find other people to play against, frankly, after you practiced it enough. A lot of the Intellivision games have that tendency. Maybe it was because the one-player game in and of itself was kind of repetitive and it wasn't overly exciting, and the tracks that were the higher number tracks and the higher faster cars were just so difficult that it wasn't that much fun. When we did get to play 2-player games, it ended up usually being just a big crash fest. You didn't feel like you were actually racing because you never really got anywhere. You'd go a little distance and somebody would spin out and you'd crash and you'd start over and you'd do it again. So it just didn't get that racing feel in the 2-player version to me. So overall, the graphics are pretty good. The sound was only fair. The playability was right middle of the road as well. But one thing about it, it was a very innovative game in the racing genre from back in the day. I got to give it credit for that, and that was one of the things we most recognized about it when we bought it. Anyhow, with all of these things taken into consideration, I'm going to give Auto Racing by Mattel a 5 out of 10 rating. Well guys, that's it for today's episode of the 125. Once again, I'd like to thank the Intellivision Collector. Make sure you visit the website for all your Intellivision needs and all your Intellivision homebrew needs. I'd like to thank them for being the official sponsor of the 125 and helping me out through this journey as I try to work my way through the entire library of Intellivision games between 1979 and 1989. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, guys. Thank you so much for spending a little time with me today, and we hope to see you next time on the next episode of the 125. You take care.
Papa Pete, the old ass gamer. Papa Pete, the old ass gamer. If you haven't grown up by the age of 50, you don't have
I'm Rick Reynolds of the Intellivisionaries podcast, and you're watching Papa Pete, the old guy gamer.